One of the most intriguing questions I receive is about the fate of the 12 tribes of Israel. Did they really disappear into history? Today, I invite you to watch this video until the end, where we will explore not only the theories about the so-called lost tribes, but also the possible clues and evidence that might reveal where they might have hidden over the centuries. Get ready for a fascinating journey through the mystery of the 12 tribes. Leave a like and share with friends and family who are also curious about this biblical enigma. Don't miss out. It's time to discover. Where are the 12 tribes of Israel? Have they really disappeared? Since the Israelites' departure from the house of bondage in Egypt, they journeyed toward the land of Canaan, the land that God had promised to Abraham as an inheritance. However, over time, the Israelites disobeyed the laws, guidelines, and commandments that God had given to Moses. This disobedience resulted in severe consequences. In the book of Leviticus, we can find the penances and judgments that God imposed on Israel after their departure from Egypt. God had made a great covenant with the Israelites, commanding them to follow His instructions and worship Him exclusively without mingling with the peoples and cultures of that land or other peoples with different cultures, gods, and languages. In Leviticus 26, verse 17, it is written, "I will set my face against you, and you shall be struck down before your enemies. Those who hate you shall rule over you, and you shall flee when no one pursues you." This verse addresses one of the penalties God imposed on Israel through the delivery of the people to their enemies and neighboring nations. According to this punishment, Israel and its tribes would become prey or be absorbed by the surrounding regions and peoples. In verse 25, we find further details about the punishment that God announced. "I will bring a sword upon you that will execute the vengeance of the covenant. And when you gather together in your cities, I will pestilence among you, and you shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy." The tribes of Israel had abandoned the covenant in alliances with God, turning to idolatry and other sins practiced by the peoples of the Middle East region. Thus, God delivered Israel to the neighboring nations, which dominated the Israelite territory, as indeed happened in history. To illustrate, the last kings of Israel are described by the prophet Hosea in 8:4 as illegitimate and usurpers of the throne of Israel. When the Israelite tribes turned to idolatry and other similar sins, God handed them over to rival nations fighting for territory, making them vassals. With the supposed disappearance of the 12 tribes of Israel, numerous theories have emerged about their whereabouts and the reason for their apparent extinction. One of the most well-known theories suggests that the Israelites were actually tribes of the Americas, meaning that indigenous peoples are descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Although this theory is quite old, it makes no sense from either a biblical or genetic standpoint. Studies show that the origin of indigenous peoples is Asian, with ancestry from East Asian and Siberian populations, among other Asian groups. Another flaw in the theory that indigenous peoples are descendants of the lost tribes of Israel is that they do not exhibit traits similar to Middle Eastern peoples. In fact, they resemble East Asian peoples more, such as Japanese, Chinese, Mongolian, and Siberian groups who inhabit the Asian part of Russia. This theory often claims that at some point the Israelites and their tribes left the land of Israel and settled in the Americas. However, we find indigenous peoples who, in many ways, live in conditions similar to the Stone Age, without the Bronze Age weapons that were common among ancient Israelites. Additionally, while the ancient Israelites wore colorful and varied clothing, indigenous peoples often appear semi-naked, painted with various colors, and wearing feathered headdresses, among other adornments. Thus, indigenous peoples of the Americas are quite distinct from ancient Semitic peoples, who dressed differently and had distinct physical characteristics, such as body hair, which is absent among indigenous peoples. With the advancement of genetic studies across various world ethnicities, such theories have completely lost their credibility as they have been disproven. Indigenous peoples of the Americas have DNA more closely related to Asian peoples, which explains features such as slanted eyes and extremely straight hair. Some indigenous groups have a browner skin tone due to mixing with ancient African Hamitic peoples, descendants of Ham. However, they maintain Asian traits that reflect their ancestry, which is biblically and logically associated with Tagarma. Despite various beliefs that Asians, such as Chinese and Japanese, might be descendants of Canaan's son, Shin, this theory has also fallen out of favor, as it does not make sense. If indigenous peoples had genetic similarities with the Israelites or with current Jews, or even with various Middle Eastern Semitic ethnicities, there might be a probability of them being considered lost tribes. However, they do not exhibit this genetic similarity. In fact, there is no genetic relation between indigenous peoples and Middle Eastern populations. In contrast, Arabs, Syrians, and Lebanese have a strong genetic similarity with Jews. Therefore, indigenous peoples are not lost tribes of Israel. Another theory that has recently gained popularity, similar to the idea that indigenous peoples are descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, is that African peoples also have ancestry from the lost tribes of Israel. This theory proposes that African peoples might have ancestry from the lost tribes of Israel. However, this idea is entirely contrary to what is accepted by contemporary Judaism and even by Jews from 1,000 years ago. Historians like Flavius Josephus claim that Africans descend from Han, specifically from the groups of Cush, Mizraim, and Put, who are considered the ancestors of African peoples. On the other hand, some theorists maintain that these African peoples are descendants of lost tribes of Israel. However, this theory does not align with the Bible, ancient interpretations, traditions, or genetics, as there is no genetic similarity with Middle Eastern peoples, Arabs, or Jews themselves. Many people claim to be descendants of Jews, but in reality, the only ethnic group with Black Jewish ancestry is the Ethiopian Jews. Despite having Jewish ancestry in their genetics, they are known as Cushitic Jews, due to their primordial and predominant origin as descendants of Cush, which gave rise to many Africans, including Ethiopians, Eritreans, Somalis, and other peoples from the region, as well as the ancient kingdom of Cush, which corresponds to Nubia, now Sudan. Indigenous peoples, on the other hand, are descended from Tagarma, while Africans are descended from Ham and his three sons, Mizraim, Cush, and Put, who are the ancestors of Libya and many African peoples. Besides this theory, there are also European theories that suggest the ancient Israelites or lost tribes might be in Europe. One such theory proposes that the lost Israelites were actually the British or the Anglo-Saxons. However, this idea has no foundation. Proponents of this theory often make serious translation errors, such as interpreting the description of David as a red-haired person. However, in the original Hebrew, the term used refers to someone who is reddish or sunburned, not someone with red hair. Therefore, this theory lacks historical or linguistic basis and does not align with the characteristics of European peoples, such as those with blonde or red hair. Ultimately, despite the various theories claiming that Jews are actually lost tribes of indigenous peoples, Africans, or even some European groups, these are merely urban legends. These ideas, which are extra-biblical and based on misguided interpretations, are currently debunked by genetics and biblical interpretations. The notion that indigenous or African peoples are lost tribes does not hold up, especially considering that the peoples of the Americas, such as the Maya, Aztecs, and Incas, were already present in the Americas before the formation of the tribes of Israel and the children of Jacob. Black peoples in Africa are among the oldest, existing long before the formation of any Hebrew or Israelite people. African peoples were already established in the region, being descendants of Cush, Mizraim, and Put. However, the big question is, where are these so-called lost tribes mentioned in history? In 722 BCE, when Assyria destroyed Samaria, the Israelite tribes were deported to Assyria itself. Specifically, in Assyria, where these Israelite tribes were located at the time, Assyria was a rival of the ancient Egyptians. Therefore, the captives of the tribes of Israel never reached Africa. For these tribes to be in Africa, they would have had to enter through Egypt, which was controlled by the Egyptians. The Assyrians and Syrians, who were rivals of Egypt, kept the Israelites as their subjugated people in the region, indefineless. Is there any biblical basis suggesting that these lost tribes are not actually lost but are in Assyria, Syria, and the Middle East region? Yes, in 2 Kings 17 verse 6, we find, "In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away to Assyria, and placed them in Hala, and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes." Many of these Israelite tribes ended up being absorbed by the peoples who arrived in these regions, as well as by the Assyrians and Syrians who had been there for a long time. Subsequently, the region experienced various conquests by different peoples, such as the Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Parthians, Turks, and finally the Arabs, with the expansion of Islam. You might think, okay, that's the Old Testament, at the end of the Old Testament, during the period when Chronicles were written. But what about the New Testament? In the New Testament, we find people from different tribes of Israel who do not belong to the tribe of Judah. For example, in the Gospel of Luke 2, verse 36, Anna from the tribe of Asher is mentioned. Another example of a tribe other than Judah is the tribe of Benjamin, from which the Apostle Paul, also known as Saul of Tarsus, is a famous representative. Although there are more verses in the New Testament mentioning other tribes, I cited these two to illustrate that the Israelites were not completely lost. In fact, these tribes did not scatter to extremely distant regions, but suffered conquests and often deviated from God, falling into sins. A point that often raises curiosity is the question of the tribes of Israel that are actually in Assyria, Syria, and other regions of the Middle East. Many people wonder about the fulfillment of biblical prophecies regarding these 12 tribes. The answer is that they will be saved, but in a different manner than originally imagined. Jesus Christ transformed Christians into the new Israel, the true people of God. The distinction between Jews and Gentiles has disappeared before God. As the Apostle Paul states, "In Christ there is no Jew or Greek." It was not by chance that these tribes mixed with Assyrian, Syrian, and other Middle Eastern peoples. This mixing has a purpose, so that, in the end times, these tribes will remember their Israelite heritage, convert to Christ, and be saved. In other words, this is all part of God's plan. Conversion is not just about Israelite heritage, but about recognizing that all are part of Shem's heritage, Noah's son. The divine plan is not to save only one ethnicity or specific people, but all peoples. Regardless of language, origin, or any other characteristic, what matters is faith in Christ and acceptance of God as Father. Thus, all who believe in Christ and become children and servants of God will be saved, not just Israelites or Semites. May God bless you and see you soon.